No one had ever seen Adrian Park hesitate. That was the reputation. In glass boardrooms and private negotiations, he moved with the same quiet certainty. Precise, controlled, untouchable. Decisions followed him. Markets adjusted around him. Men who built empires twice his size learned quickly not to mistake his calm for mercy. For years, Adrian had perfected one rule. Forward only. No distractions. No attachments. No looking back. And it worked. Until the morning his executive assistant walked in 5 minutes early and placed a single name on his schedule. The building around him continued its usual rhythm. Elevators gliding, phones ringing, analysts rushing between meetings, but Adrian's attention had already narrowed to one line of text. Zainab Bello. Across the city, she moved through her own morning with practiced composure. Focused. Entirely self-contained. The woman who once waited for Adrian Park had long since learned a different skill. How to walk away without looking back. What Adrian didn't know, what no one in his carefully controlled world had realized yet, was that this meeting was not just another negotiation. It was a collision. Because the only woman Adrian Park had ever abandoned was now the only woman he might not survive losing twice. Adrian Park's empire did not rise by accident. It was built the way he did everything else. Quietly, precisely, without wasted motion. From the top floor of Park Holdings, the city stretched beneath him in clean, glittering lines. Glass towers, moving traffic, the distant shimmer of the river cutting through steel and concrete. Most men admired views like this. Adrian measured them. Numbers moved across the screen in front of him, projections adjusting in real time as another overseas acquisition finalized. Soft chimes sounded. Proved. Just like the last one. Just like the next one would be. Consistency was power. Predictability was control. And Adrian Park did not lose control. Inside the executive floor, movement followed a rhythm he had engineered over years. Assistants spoke in lowered tones. Meetings began exactly on time. Reports arrived already filtered down to what mattered. There was no chaos here. No surprises. No emotional noise cluttering the air. That had been intentional. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, expression unreadable, fingers steepled loosely beneath his chin. To anyone watching, he looked relaxed. Untouchable. It was a carefully maintained illusion. Because Adrian did not believe in comfort. He believed in discipline. Every morning began the same way. Before sunrise, before the city fully woke. 30 minutes of silence. 30 minutes of review. 30 minutes reminding himself of the rule that had carried him further than anyone who once stood beside him. Forward only. No hesitation. No second-guessing. No looking back. Looking back created weakness. He had learned that lesson early. Long before the tailored suits, long before the boardroom victories, long before men started lowering their voices when he entered a room. Regret was expensive. Attachment was worse. So he had cut both out of his life with the same clean precision he used in business. Efficient. Necessary. Final. Across the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning light shifted, sliding slowly across the polished surface of his desk. Adrian's gaze followed it for a moment, distant, calculating, as if even the sun's movement could be reduced to something measurable. Behind the calm exterior, his world remained exactly as he preferred it. Ordered, controlled, untouchable. Least it had been. His phone buzzed once against the glass surface. A single message from his assistant. Confirmation received. Zainab Bello will attend the merger meeting at noon. For the first time that morning, Adrian's fingers stilled. The silence in his office did not change. The city below did not slow. Nothing visible shifted at all. But somewhere beneath the polished discipline, beneath the years of careful control, something old and unwelcome moved. Quiet as a fault line under pressure. Adrian Park did not look back. He never had. But as the seconds ticked quietly forward, one thought pressed in anyway. Persistent, unwelcome, impossible to ignore. And for the first time in a very long while, forward did not feel simple anymore. Zainab Bello did not arrive early. She arrived exactly on time. The black car stopped smoothly beneath the mirrored facade of Park Holdings, engine quiet, presence deliberate. For a moment nothing moved. Then the rear door opened, and Zainab stepped out with a kind of composure that didn't ask to be noticed, and didn't need to. Years had refined her. Where she had once been warm-eyed and openly expressive, there was now a calm precision to her movements. Her posture was effortless, her expression unreadable. Even the way she adjusted the cuff of her sleeve carried quiet authority. Inside the lobby, the usual morning current continued. Executives in motion, assistants crossing polished floors, the low murmur of business already underway. But awareness had a way of shifting around certain people. Zainab walked through the space without slowing, without scanning the room, without betraying even the smallest flicker of hesitation. She had learned that skill the hard way. At the reception desk, her name was already expected. "Ms. Bello," the assistant said, professional but noticeably sharper now. "Welcome to Park Holdings." Zainab offered a small, polite nod. Nothing more. No extra warmth. No unnecessary conversation. No sign that this building, or the man who owned most of it, had ever once mattered to her. The elevator ride was silent. Glass walls. Soft lighting. The smooth upward glide toward the executive floor. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface. Composed, controlled, entirely self-contained. Not the woman who used to wait. Not the woman who used to believe patience meant loyalty. That version of her had learned its lesson. By the time the elevator doors opened, Zainab's expression was perfectly neutral again. The executive corridor stretched ahead. Quiet, expensive, carefully controlled. Familiar in a way she refused to acknowledge. An assistant approached quickly, posture respectful. "The boardroom is prepared, Ms. Bello. Mr. Park will join shortly." Small pause. Just long enough to notice. Zainab simply inclined her head. "Thank you." No reaction to his name. No visible shift in her breathing. No sign that 10 years ago, that name had once rearranged her entire world. She moved toward the boardroom doors with the same steady confidence she had carried since stepping out of the car. Each step measured. Each movement intentional. The soft click of her heels against marble echoed briefly, then faded into the controlled quiet of the executive floor. Inside the boardroom, floor-to-ceiling windows poured light across the long polished table. Zainab took her seat without hesitation, folded her hands calmly in front of her, and waited. Not with anticipation. Not with nerves. Not with anything that resembled the woman Adrian Park thought he remembered. Across the city, markets shifted and deals moved quietly into place. But in the stillness of the boardroom, one truth had already settled into the air. Cool, steady, and immovable. Zainab Bello had not come back to where he left her. She had come back as someone he had never truly known. And this time, she wasn't the one waiting. By the time Adrian Park entered the boardroom, the air had already settled into something carefully neutral. On the surface, nothing was unusual. The long table gleamed under morning light. Digital screens glowed quietly along the far wall. Executives sat composed and prepared, tablets open, expressions professionally blank. It was the kind of room Adrian controlled without effort. Until his gaze found her. Zainab Bello did not look up immediately. She sat poised at the opposite end of the table, shoulders relaxed, attention on the documents in front of her as if this were just another high-level negotiation. Just another morning. Just another name on her calendar. The precision of it was not lost on him. Adrian took his seat at the head of the table, movements smooth, unhurried. To anyone else, the moment passed cleanly, the quiet authority of a CEO entering his domain. But the temperature in the room had shifted. Early, quietly, undeniably. "Ms. Bello," Adrian said at last, voice even measured. Only then did she lift her eyes. The contact was brief, professional, controlled, and completely unlike the way she used to look at him. "Mr. Park," Zainab replied. No warmth, No hesitation. No trace of the woman who once waited outside a small cafe in the rain, checking her phone every few seconds while the minutes stretched too long. The memory surfaced without permission. Adrian ignored it. The meeting began. Voices moved through projections and market forecasts. Terms were outlined. Numbers dissected. On paper, it was exactly the kind of negotiation Adrian excelled at. Clean, strategic, impersonal. Except nothing about this felt impersonal. Across the table, Zainab spoke with calm authority, her analysis sharp, her tone composed. She didn't over-explain. Didn't hedge. Didn't once look toward Adrian for validation. She didn't need it. Adrian listened, expression unreadable, but his attention had narrowed in ways that had nothing to do with the deal structure. She had changed her cadence. Her posture. Even the way she paused before speaking. Deliberate now, controlled. There had been a time when her pauses meant uncertainty. Now they meant calculation. Which is why our firm is proposing a revised equity structure. Zainab finished smoothly. A quiet ripple moved through the room. It was a strong position. Stronger than he expected. Adrian's fingers tapped once lightly against the table. The only outward sign he had registered the shift. An ambitious adjustment, he said. Their eyes met again. Still professional. Still distant. But beneath the polished exchange, something older pressed quietly against the surface. Unfinished and unwelcome. Zainab held his gaze without flinching. An appropriate one. The room stilled for half a breath. Not confrontation. Not quite. But close enough that the executives nearest the table edge straightened slightly in their seats. Adrian leaned back a fraction, studying her with the same cool precision he used on every opponent who thought they understood the board. Except this wasn't unfamiliar territory. And that was the problem. Because as the meeting continued and the numbers moved forward, one realization settled quietly into Adrian Park's carefully controlled mind. Zainab Bello wasn't just negotiating with him. She was matching him. And somewhere beneath the glass and steel and years of disciplined distance, old ghosts had started walking back into the room. By the midpoint of the meeting, the numbers had stopped behaving predictably. That alone was unusual. Adrian Park had built his reputation on reading the direction of a deal before most people finished their opening statements. Patterns revealed themselves to him early. Weaknesses surfaced quickly. Outcomes rarely surprised him. Today, the projections refused to settle neatly into place. Across the table, Zainab moved with quiet confidence, sliding a revised document forward with the same steady composure she had maintained since entering the room. Our firm is prepared to assume operational oversight of the Lagos expansion, she said evenly. With full decision authority on regional deployment. A subtle ripple passed through the executives. It was a bold request. Not reckless. Calculated. Adrian's gaze dropped briefly to the updated figures. Clean. Precise. Carefully modeled. Whoever had built this proposal understood both the market and him far too well. His fingers stilled against the table. Interesting. Around them, voices resumed their careful rhythm. Legal clarifications. Risk assessments. Projected timelines. On the surface, the meeting remained exactly what it was supposed to be. Professional. Structured. Controlled. But something underneath had begun to shift. Adrian leaned back slightly, studying Zainab with the same quiet intensity he reserved for high-risk negotiations. She didn't look toward him. Didn't seek reaction. She simply waited, composed and patient, as if she already understood the pressure points she had just introduced into the room. That, more than the numbers, unsettled him. She wasn't pushing blindly. She was positioning. Given current market volatility, the adjustment is reasonable, one of his senior analysts admitted carefully. Another small shift in the room. Adrian's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Zainab folded her hands lightly on the table. We believe it reflects the true risk distribution. Measured. Unapologetic. For a brief moment, the memory surfaced again. Her voice years ago, softer then, asking questions instead of making declarations. He shut the thought down immediately. Irrelevant. And yet, his gaze returned to the proposal. If he accepted her terms, Park Holdings would retain the merger, but operational control in one of the fastest-growing regions would tilt subtly in her favor. If he refused, the deal risked stalling. Either outcome carried weight. Across the table, Zainab finally met his eyes again. No challenge. No emotion. Just quiet certainty. The silence stretched half a second too long. Not enough for anyone else to notice. More than enough for Adrian. For the first time since the meeting began, something unfamiliar pressed against the edges of his carefully maintained control. Not doubt. Not exactly. But unease, sharp and precise. Because this wasn't just a strong negotiation position. It was leverage. And Zainab Bello was holding it with a steadiness that told him one thing very clearly. She had not walked back into his world unprepared. She had come back ready to win. And for the first time in years, Adrian Park found himself facing a negotiation where the outcome was no longer entirely his to dictate. The meeting adjourned with practiced efficiency. Chairs shifted. Tablets closed. Quiet conversations resumed in low professional tones as executives filtered toward the door. On paper, nothing unusual had happened. The negotiation remained open. The numbers were still moving. But the air had changed. Adrian remained seated a moment longer than necessary, gaze lowered to the documents in front of him, though he was no longer reading them. Across the table, Zainab gathered her materials with the same composed precision she had carried all morning. He stood. So did he. The others exited first. A subtle courtesy no one announced, but everyone understood. Within seconds, the expansive boardroom had emptied into a controlled silence broken only by the distant hum of the building. Zainab turned toward the door. Ms. Bello. He paused. Not startled. Not hesitant. Just still. Slowly she faced him. Yes, Mr. Park. The distance between them wasn't large. It only felt that way. Adrian studied her for a moment, expression carefully neutral. Up close, the changes were even more precise. The steadiness in her posture, the absence of the small tells he used to read so easily. You've adjusted your strategy, he said. It was not a question. Zainab's gaze held his evenly. Markets evolve. Clean answer. Professional. Impersonal. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For years, conversations between them had never required this level of distance. There had been a time when silence between them meant comfort, not calculation. Another unwelcome memory surfaced. Late evenings over unfinished coffee, her voice softer then, asking if he ever planned to slow down. He had given the same answer he always gave. Not yet. Adrian exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavier than he intended. You're prepared to walk away from the merger. This time her pause was deliberate. If the terms require it, Zainab said. Unmoved. And entirely believable. Something in his chest shifted. Sharp, unwelcome, and dangerously close to recognition. He had seen competitors bluff before. This wasn't a bluff. Silence stretched between them, thinner now, more charged. You always were patient, Adrian said quietly. The words slipped out before he could refine them. For the first time since she entered the building, something flickered in Zainab's eyes. Not softness, not quite anger. Something older. I learned not to wait, she replied. The statement landed with surgical precision. For a brief second, brief enough that no one else would have caught it, Adrian's composure cracked at the edges. Not visibly, not enough to name, but enough to feel. Regret was expensive. He had known that. What he had not accounted for was how interest accumulated over time. Zainab adjusted the folder in her hands, posture already resetting back into perfect professional distance. If there's nothing further, Mr. Park. Title again. Careful. Final. Adrian held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken pressing at the back of his throat, unfamiliar and unwelcome. He did not stop her. Zainab turned and walked toward the door without looking back. The soft click of her heels faded into the corridor. And Adrian Park, who had built an empire on control, stood alone in the quiet boardroom with one realization settling in with uncomfortable clarity. For the first time in years, control was starting to slip. And it had nothing to do with the deal. The rain started just before dusk. It came down in clean, steady lines against the glass of Adrian's office, softening the city into something blurred and distant. Most evenings, he appreciated weather like this. Simplified things, muted distractions, kept the world moving in predictable patterns. Tonight, nothing felt predictable. A quiet knock sounded once. Before his assistant could announce it, the door opened. Zainab Bello stepped inside. She did not apologize for the interruption. She did not hesitate at the threshold. She simply walked in with the same calm authority she had carried all day. Composed, self-contained, and entirely deliberate. Adrian rose slowly from behind his desk. "Ms. Bello." Her gaze held his without warmth. "We need to clarify something." "Not we should. Not if you have time." "Need." The words settled between them with quiet weight. Adrian gestured once toward the seating area. "Go ahead." Zainab didn't sit. That was the first signal. Instead, she remained standing, hands loosely clasped in front of her. Posture straight but not rigid. Controlled. Intentional. The distance between them felt measured. Not by the room, but by years neither of them had fully buried. "You told the board today that timing was the reason the Lagos partnership dissolved 10 years ago," she said evenly. Adrian's expression didn't change. "It was," he replied. Zainab's head tilted slightly. Not disbelief. Recognition. "That's not the truth, Adrian." His name, spoken without title, landed sharper than anything else she'd said all day. For a moment, the rain against the glass seemed louder. Adrian's jaw tightened, the only visible crack in his composure. "You made a decision," Zainab continued, voice calm but carrying something deeper beneath the surface. "You chose expansion over the partnership. Over everything else that came with it." The memory surfaced whether he allowed it or not. Late-night calls he stopped returning. Messages left unanswered. A flight he boarded without telling her until after the deal was signed. At the time it had been simple. Necessary. Efficient. Adrian's voice remained controlled. "The company required my full attention." Zainab let out a quiet breath. Not sharp. Not angry. Just tired. "That's the version you tell investors," she said softly. "It's not the one you told me." The air in the room shifted. Early, but unmistakably. For the first time since she walked back into his world, Adrian felt the balance of the conversation tilt. Not in the boardroom, not in the numbers, but here, in the space he usually controlled without effort. Zainab finally moved closer, just one measured step. "You didn't just choose the company," she said, her voice steady but no longer distant. "You chose not to explain. You chose not to come back." Each word landed clean, precise, unavoidable. Something old pressed hard against Adrian's carefully maintained restraint. Something that sounded dangerously close to the truth he had spent 10 years refusing to revisit. Across from him, Zainab's gaze did not waver. "You didn't lose me, Adrian," she said quietly. A beat of silence passed. "You let me go." And for the first time since she walked back into Park Holdings, the power in the room no longer belonged entirely to him. Adrian did not answer her immediately. He rarely reacted in real time. That had always been one of his advantages, the ability to absorb impact without showing the fracture. But after Zainab left his office, the quiet she left behind did not settle the way it usually did. It lingered, sharp at the edges. By midnight, the executive floor was nearly empty. Most lights across Park Holdings had dimmed into after-hours stillness, the building returning to its controlled mechanical rhythm. Adrian remained in his office, working, or at least appearing to. A different file now sat open on his screen. Not the merger summary, not the Lagos projections, but a detailed risk assessment tied directly to Bello Strategic Group's regional operations. He read every line, then reached for his phone. "Restructure the compliance review," he said quietly when the call connected. "Priority level." A brief pause on the other end. "Yes, sir." "And flag any external pressure points tied to Bello's expansion permits. I want early visibility." He ended the call before further questions could follow. Across the glass walls of his office, the city glowed in muted gold and steel. From this height, everything looked orderly, predictable, manageable. But Adrian had learned long ago that the real threats rarely announced themselves. They surfaced quietly. The way leverage had surfaced in Zainab's proposal. The way something uncomfortably close to regret had surfaced in his chest. By morning the shifts began. Subtle enough that no one outside the executive tier would notice. A routine audit request redirected. A regulatory inquiry quietly fast-tracked. Two competing firms that had been circling Bello Strategic's Lagos expansion suddenly found their own compliance reviews delayed. Indefinitely. No announcements. No signatures bearing his name. Just pressure, carefully redistributed. Inside the executive briefing room later that afternoon, Adrian listened with his usual detached focus as his legal director summarized the adjustments. "Bello Strategic's exposure has been significantly reduced," she reported. "If anything, their position in the region just became unusually secure." "Unusual?" Adrian's expression didn't change. "That will be all," he said. The room cleared quickly. When the door closed, silence returned. Familiar, controlled, and far easier to manage than the conversation Zainab had forced into the open the night before. He told himself this was strategic. Nothing more. Stabilizing the merger environment. Protecting the long-term deal structure. Clean. Rational. Necessary. But as Adrian stood near the window, watching the city move in slow, glittering currents below, one truth settled in with quiet persistence. This was not the kind of protection he extended to competitors. And it certainly wasn't standard corporate procedure. Somewhere along the line, somewhere between the boardroom and 10 years of carefully buried history, Adrian Park had made a decision. Not spoken, not acknowledged, but unmistakably real. Because whether Zainab Bello ever noticed the invisible shields closing quietly around her or not, he was no longer standing at a professional distance. And for a man who built his empire on never looking back, that was the most dangerous shift of all. Zainab noticed the shift 3 days later. At first, it was small enough to dismiss. An approval that cleared faster than expected. A regulatory inquiry that quietly dissolved before it reached her desk. A competitor's sudden withdrawal from a bid they had been aggressively pursuing for months. Individually, each development could be explained. Together, they formed a pattern. Zainab stood by the window of her temporary office inside Park Holdings, tablet in hand, eyes moving slowly over the latest update from her legal team. Her expression remained composed, but something sharper had settled behind it. She had spent too many years building her position to miss invisible hands at work. And there was only one person in this building who moved this quietly. The knock on Adrian's office door came without hesitation. He looked up once. "Come in." Zainab stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The city stretched in muted evening light beyond the glass walls, but the air between them felt far less controlled than it had days ago. Adrian rose slowly, reading the change in her posture immediately. Not distant. Not professional. Focused. "You've been busy," she said. Not an accusation. Not quite. Adrian's expression remained neutral. "The merger requires attention." Zainab took a measured step forward, placing the tablet on the edge of his desk and turning it toward him. The screen displayed a clean sequence of regulatory reversals and market withdrawals. "Too clean." "Your attention," she said quietly. "Or your protection." The words settled heavily between them. For the first time since she walked back into his world, Adrian did not answer immediately. Zainab watched him carefully. There it was. Precise. but unmistakable. The hesitation. Her voice softened, not in warmth but in certainty. You moved the compliance review. You redirected the Lagos pressure. You cleared 3 separate obstacles that weren't yours to clear. Adrian's jaw tightened. Still no denial. Zainab exhaled slowly, something complicated flickering beneath her calm exterior. Why? One word. No room to maneuver around it. The silence that followed was different from the ones he usually controlled. Thinner. Sharper. Pressing into spaces he preferred to keep sealed. Adrian stepped away from the desk, moving toward the window, gaze fixed on the city below. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, measured, but no longer untouched. You were exposed in that region, he said. I corrected the imbalance. Clinical, strategic, almost convincing. Zainab didn't move. You don't correct imbalances for competitors. Another silence. Longer this time. The kind that didn't hide anything. Slowly, Adrian turned back to face her. For the first time since this began, something in his expression had shifted. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else in the building to notice. But Zainab saw it. She had always seen it. I don't, he admitted. The words landed heavier than any denial could have. The air between them tightened. Zainab's voice dropped, quieter now, but edged with something far more dangerous than anger. So say it clearly, Adrian. Beat past. Then another. And for the first time in a decade of flawless control, Adrian Park, the man who feared no rival, felt the exact shape of the truth pressing against his restraint. Not strategy. Not leverage. Not the merger. His next breath came slower, less certain. And when he finally spoke, the control in his voice had cracked just enough to matter. You were about to walk out of my reach again. The confession hung in the air between them. Unprotected. And impossible to take back. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city beyond the glass continued its quiet rhythm. Headlights threading through traffic, distant buildings glowing against the dark. But inside Adrian's office, the air had tightened into something far more fragile. Zainab studied him carefully. Not shocked. Not softened. But no longer entirely distant. You don't get to decide my reach, Adrian, she said at last, her voice calm but edged with steel. The words should have restored the balance. They should have pushed him cleanly back into the controlled distance he understood. They didn't. Adrian held her gaze, the usual precision in his expression still present, but thinner now, stretched over something far less manageable. I'm not trying to decide it, he said quietly. It was the closest thing to an admission she had ever heard from him. Zainab's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tablet in her hand. Small movement, almost invisible. But Adrian noticed. He always had. You already did once, she replied. There it was. Not raised in anger. Not thrown like an accusation. Just placed between them. Carefully. 10 years of silence compressed into a single line. The memory pressed in without invitation. An airport terminal, a contract waiting for his signature, a phone call he had convinced himself could wait until after the deal closed. Never had. Adrian's voice lowered another degree. I made the decision I thought was necessary. Zainab's expression didn't soften. Necessary for who? The question landed clean. Precise. And for the first time in years, Adrian Park did not have an answer ready. Silence stretched, long enough to matter. Zainab exhaled slowly, some of the sharpness in her posture easing, not into forgiveness, but into something more complicated. Measured distance. I didn't come back for unfinished history, she said. I came back for the merger. Professional again. Careful again. But the line between past and present had already blurred too much to fully restore. Adrian took a slow step closer. Not crowding her. Not reaching. Just closing enough distance that the air shifted again. You're still leaving once it closes, he said. Not a question. Her gaze flickered, brief, controlled, then steadied. Yes. One word. Unwavering. Something tight and unfamiliar pulled low in Adrian's chest. He had faced hostile takeovers, market collapses, men who built their reputations on trying to outmaneuver him. None of it had ever felt like this. Zainab straightened slightly, composure settling back into place like armor. "We both moved on," she said quietly. "You built your empire. I built my own. True, clean, reasonable, and somehow incomplete." Adrian's next words came slower, carefully chosen, but no longer entirely protected. "I never moved on from you." The confession fell into the space between them, quieter than the one before, but infinitely more dangerous. For the first time since entering his office, Zainab's breath caught. Gone almost immediately. But Adrian saw it. And this time, she didn't look away first. The silence that followed was no longer professional, no longer controlled. Just two people standing in the space where 10 years of unfinished decisions still lived. Finally Zainab stepped back. Just one step. Enough to rebuild the distance. Enough to protect herself. "The merger meeting resumes tomorrow at 9, she said, voice steady again, but not untouched. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Her hand paused briefly on the handle. Not hesitation. Not quite. Just long enough to leave something unresolved in the air. When the door closed behind her, Adrian remained where he stood, the city glowing cold and distant beyond the glass. For the first time in his carefully constructed life, the outcome ahead of him wasn't something he could calculate, because this wasn't about leverage anymore. And if Zainab Bello walked away again, Adrian Park was no longer certain he would survive it the same way twice.